This is the ultimate Holden build guide. If you have been wondering how to build your Holden, or how he fares up against the content in this game, this video is for you. We will go over his kit, his best modules, shells, and which content he works best in.
The general consensus is pretty clear. Holden is definitely a top-tier character. He's incredibly versatile.
Domination is good.
Yeah, his kit just lets him adapt to a lot of different situations. He obviously has an advantage where reason element is strong, but honestly, he's considered excellent even when element neutral, just because his utility and scaling are that potent.
Okay, so let's see the report card. What are his ratings in the main content areas?
All right, let's run through the tier list placements. Generic PvE content like story stages, general farming, T0, top tier.
Zero. Wow.
Aurora, T0.5, so excellent, just shy of the absolute top.
Okay, still very strong.
Doki Doki, T4. This is the outlier. Seems he's considered niche or less effective there.
T4, okay, noted. Big drop.
Terrameton, back up to T0, top tier again.
Nice. That makes sense with the S3 auto battle potential.
Union Boss and Phantom, also T0, top tier for endgame bossing.
T0 across the board for major PvE bosses then, pretty much.
And finally, PvP, also T0, top tier in player versus player as well.
Okay, that is a very impressive list of ratings. T0 in generic PvE, Terrameton, Union Boss, Phantom, and PvP. Doki Doki seems like the only place he doesn't dominate, so why? What makes him perform so incredibly well in most places, especially that endgame PvE and PvP?
It really comes back to the synergy and the raw power within his kit, especially when you invest heavily in him. His late-game damage potential, fueled by that S1 passive and high DEF, is genuinely competitive with many top ATK scaling DPS characters. It just requires the right build to unlock, you know?
Right, the investment matter.
Definitely. Then there's his S3 utility. It's just a game changer in so many hard stages. Those high chance dispels, the strong ATK, the RES, they provide immense value. Team survival goes way up, overall damage output improves because enemies are softer, and your debuffs land easier thanks to RES down. That RES down helps everyone on your team, not just Holden.
That's a really good point about RES down benefiting the whole team.
And his S2, while yes, it's limited on the big PvE bosses, it's still a fantastic single target burst damage tool. And in PvP, where that CD lock does work, it's absolutely devastating, completely game-changing sometimes.
He's naturally tanky, right?
Exactly. Because he scales damage off DEF, he doesn't have to sacrifice his own durability for offense in the same way a glass cannon ATK scaler often does. He's inherently tough. And then, of course, that S1 passive just keeps rewarding you for stacking DF, making his damage and counterattack scale incredibly well into the very late game.
You mentioned team composition earlier related to buffs. Can you expand on that? There was something about DF buffs being particularly good for him.
Absolutely. This is a key point for maximizing his damage, especially in those really demanding fights like Union Boss or Phantom. To push Holden's damage to its absolute peak, having a teammate who provides a DEF plus buff is incredibly valuable. Arguably even more valuable than a standard ATK plus buff is for a typical ATK-based DPS.
More valuable? Why is that?
Because of the percentages. A typical DEF plus buff in this game gives a 60% increase to the DEF stat. Compare that to a standard ATK plus buff, which usually gives only a 40% increase to ATK.
60%, 40, that's 40%. That's a significant difference.
It is. It means a good DEF buffer gives Holden a proportionally larger boost to his main damage stat than a standard ATK buffer gives to an ATK character. That translates directly into a bigger damage jump for Holden. So yeah, team composition definitely matters if you want to see his biggest numbers.
Okay, that makes perfect sense. And what about that T0 rating in PvP? How does he leverage his kit so well there?
PvP is really where Holden's entire kit just clicks together perfectly, you know, without that PvE boss limitation on S2. His S2 becomes insanely disruptive. Imagine hitting the enemy's main damage dealer or their fastest unit or their key support with that 100% TM, pushback, and skill lock. It can completely dismantle their opening strategy.
Yeah, neutralizing one key unit is huge in PvP.
Huge. Then his S3 is invaluable for stripping buffs like immunity or invincibility before your team goes, or removing dangerous ATK buffs from the enemy. And don't forget, his S1 counterattack. If you build him for it, especially with certain gear sets we'll talk about, he can seriously punish those fast, aggressive teams that rely on lots of attacks. Those counters, fueled by high DEF and his passive, hit surprisingly hard, especially against squishier targets.
So he can disrupt, debuff, dispel, and hit back hard. Seems like he fits multiple PvP roles. What about his speed?
His base speed is okay, kind of middle of the road. So he's not necessarily going to be the absolute first character to move, unless you invest heavily into speed stats on his gear, or, more commonly, pair him with dedicated turn meter boosters. Units like Lily, Mio, Tsukio Mia characters who pull your team's turns forward. That's a very common and effective strategy to make sure Holden gets his S2 or S3 off at a critical moment early in the fight.
So use boosters to compensate for his average speed.
Exactly. But even if he doesn't move first, his natural bulk and that counterattack threat mean he's still a persistent danger even if he acts later in the turn order.
Okay, so incredibly effective pretty much everywhere that matters, except maybe Doki Doki. He brings damage and top-tier utility. To make sure we have the full picture, though, let's get a balanced view. What are the absolute standout positives, the pros, and what are the main drawbacks, the cons?
Right, looking at the summary points, his strengths are pretty significant. On the pro side, first, his S3 steadfast conviction is often called a godsend, and honestly, that's not really an exaggeration for a lot of tough stages, including most bosses. That mix of AoE damage, reliable dispel, win critting, and those potent ATK and RES debuffs. It just provides crucial stability, makes your team survive longer and hit harder. It's incredibly valuable.
Yeah, that S3 utility seems central.
It really is.
Yeah.
Second pro, that S1 passive, execution mode. It grants him exceptionally high damage potential in the late game. Once you optimize his gear, stack that DEF, those multipliers become enormous. He can genuinely compete with the best DPS units out there.
Third.
S2,
Yeah.
strike through.
Yeah.
It's unique and powerful. In content where the full effect works, like PvP, it can legitimately make a single enemy utterly useless, just taking them out of the equation by resetting their turn and locking their skills.
Okay, anything else?
Yeah, a couple more. If you're building him mainly for support for the S2 control and S3 utility, you don't need to rush maxing his S1 right away. S2 and S3 get most of their key utility benefits, like higher chances and lower cooldowns, even at just level 3. Maxing S1 is really mostly for pushing his DPS to the max.
So you can get good utility without the full skill book investment immediately.
Yeah, exactly. And finally, when you combine his S1 passive's counter chance with a specific gear set like Bramble, which adds more counter chance, and stack high DEF, his overall chance to counterattack can become extremely reliable. He becomes a real deterrent just sitting there.
Okay, those are some compelling pros. What about the flip side? What are the cons we need to be aware of?
There are definitely some important cons to consider. First, and this is a big one if your goal is top-tier damage, to unlock his full potential as a primary DPS, you absolutely must invest the resources to get his S1, Punishment, maxed out to level 5. Without those maximum multipliers from execution mode at level 5, his late-game damage is significantly lower. It's basically a required investment for DPS builds.
So expensive to max out for damage. Got it.
Second con, anything that messes with his ability to land critical hits really hurts his overall stability and effectiveness. And this isn't just about losing some damage. It critically impacts the consistency of his S3 utility. Remember, that 100% chance to dispel and debuff on S3 only happens on a critical hit. If he can't crit reliably because of enemy buffs, debuffs on him, or just not enough crit rate on his gear, his utility consistency plummets.
Right. That S3 crit dependency is a potential weakness.
It is. And the third con, which we've mentioned but needs repeating, half of the power of his S2, that skill cooldown maximization effect, simply does not work on most major PvE bosses and challenges. This limits its utility in some of the highest stakes PvE fights, although the damage and the turn meter push still have value.
Okay, that paints a really clear picture. S1 maxing is key for damage, crit rate is foundational for everything, and S2 has that PvE boss limitation.
Got it. All right, we've laid all the groundwork. Kit, role, pros, cons. Now for the core of it, building him. Let's talk gear. How do you actually equip Holden to squeeze the most out of this unique DEF scaling setup? Starting with shells.
Right, gearing Holden. It's definitely a different puzzle than your standard ATK scaler. Our focus here is going to be mainly on optimal PvE builds, but we'll definitely flag PvP-specific options when they come up. And, it's worth saying, early game, you're basically just using whatever gear you can find that pushes you towards the stats and sets we're about to discuss. Even lower rarity stuff is fine initially, just aim for the concepts.
Makes sense. Build towards the ideal.
Yeah.
So shells first. Which one's the winner for Holden?
Okay, shells. These are the big foundational pieces, providing baseful stats and that unique passive effect. For Holden, especially for general PvE use, there's one shell that consistently stands out as the most recommended, the most well-rounded choice, and that's the Artisan Shell. Artisan. Okay, what does Artisan do, and why is it so good for him?
So the Artisan Shell's effect triggers at the start of the wearer's turn, but there's an initial one-turn cooldown on it first. After that, it increases the wearer's DEF by a flat 700 points for 2 turns.
Plus 700 DEF. Nice.
Yeah, it's a solid chunk. And it also grants a shield. This shield goes onto the wearer and onto the ally who currently has the lowest HP percentage. The shield's strength is really substantial. It scales to 400% of the wearer's DEF, and it lasts for 2 turns as well. Important note, this shield effect doesn't stack with other similar shell effects like from another Artisan user.
Okay, so a big DEF buff and a massive DEF scaling shield for 2 allies. Why is that the best overall package for Holden?
Several key reasons. First, the base stats on the Artisan Shell itself are generally good for him. Second, and more importantly, that plus 700 DEF buff is active a lot, roughly 2/3 of his turns after that initial cooldown. This directly boosts his damage and makes his S1 passive even stronger while the buff is up. Third, that shield is enormous because it scales off his naturally high DE. This adds tremendous survivability, not just for Holden himself, but also for protecting a potentially squishy teammate. It just makes him incredibly tanky while also providing significant team utility.
And module access.
Yes, that's the final piece. The Artisan Shell gives you access to a pool of modules that includes many of the most desirable set bonuses for him. While you might find another shell that gives slightly more raw damage in a vacuum or has a very specific PvP use, Artisan's combination of the DEF buff, the huge utility shield, and the great survivability just makes it the best all-around package for most content.
Okay, so Artisan is the workhorse. Fantastic blend of offense, defense, and utility. Are there other shells that people use, maybe for more niche situations, like you mentioned, particularly PvP?
Yeah, absolutely. There are definitely alternative shells that are seen more as specialist options, often brought out specifically for PvP to counter certain enemy strategies where Artisan might not be enough.
Like what?
One example is Alicorn. This shell's effect kicks in at the start of the wearer's turn if they have debuffs on them. If they do, it dispels 2 of those debuffs and gives them effect RES, 25% per debuff, dispelled for 2 turns. This is a 4-turn cooldown.
Ah, self-cleansing.
Exactly. You'd use this mainly in PvP to stop Holden from getting locked down by stuns or freezes on turn 1, making sure he can actually use his S2 or S3 to disrupt the opponent.
Makes sense. Any others?
Another one is Lighthouse. This triggers if Holden takes a big hit specifically, damage over 25% of his max HP in one go. If that happens, it heals him for 25% of his max HP and pushes his turn meter forward by 25%. This has a 2-turn cooldown.
Okay, so personal survival and a bit of turn cycling after getting chunked.
Yep. Good for PvP, sustain against burst damage, helps him recover, and maybe get another turn quicker.
And there was one more you mentioned in the outline. Amber.
Right, Amber. This one's the cheat death shell. Basically, once every 6 turns, if Holden would take fatal damage, Amber prevents it. It has his current turn meter, removes all effects from him, buffs and debuffs, heals him for 60% of his max HP, and puts him into a special 1-turn state called Iced.
Iced? What's that do?
Iced makes him immune to turn meter reduction, immune to buffs, immune to debuffs, and gives him a massive plus 200% DDF boost for that turn.
Wow. That sounds incredibly strong for survival.
It's a very powerful PvP option, yeah. Guarantees a high-value unit like Holden survives at least 1 kill shot, effectively giving him a second life in the fight.
Okay, those definitely sound like specific PvP counter picks. Artisan is the reliable default. The others are tactical tools. So shells lay the foundation. Modules are where you layer on the specific stats and set bonuses, right? What module sets work best for Holden, especially under that recommended Artisan shell?
Exactly. Modules let you really customize. When you're using Artisan, you get access to a specific group of modules, allowing different set combos. The general strategy is to prioritize activating the biggest set bonuses first, so 12-piece sets if you can, then look at 8-piece sets, and finally fill the remaining slots, maybe with a 6-piece or smaller sets.
Okay, so what are the top 12-piece options available with Artisan?
For 12-piece sets, there are 2 main contenders. First is Unbreakable. This is your pure DF boost set. It gives DEF plus 10% at 4 pieces, plus 25% at 8 pieces, and a really hefty plus 45% DEF at the full 12 pieces.
Straightforward DEF.
Yeah, its value is simple. More DF means more damage for Holden, more survivability, and better scaling on his S1 passive. Whether it's better than the alternative often comes down to those 500 DEF breakpoints we talked about for S1. If that extra 45% DEF pushes you over a crucial threshold, Unbreakable can actually be his highest damage set. It's also generally pretty accessible to farm.
Okay, DEF stacking. What's the other 12-piece option?
The other main one is Swiftrush. This set is all about speed. It gives SPD plus 8% at 4 pieces, plus 20% at 8, and plus 35% speed at 12 pieces.
Big speed boost. When would you pick this over Unbreakable?
You'd go for Swiftrush if you absolutely need Holden to act earlier in the turn order. Maybe you need his S3 dispel and debuffs to land before the enemy takes their turn, or you need to hit a key target with his S2 turn meter push right away. It's especially valuable if your team doesn't have other strong turn meter boosters.
But if your team already makes him fast enough,
then the value of Swiftrush drops, yeah. You might get more benefit from the raw DEF of Unbreakable or the utility of other sets. It's a trade-off based on team needs.
Okay, so maximize DEF to hit S1 breakpoints or maximize speed for turn order control. Makes sense. What about 8-piece sets? You'd pair these with a 12-piece and a 6-piece, maybe?
Right, or sometimes you might even run 2 8-piece sets, depending on the stats you need. For 8-piece sets available under the Artisan module pool, the top options include: first, Bramble. This one is really interesting and synergizes incredibly well with Holden. It gives DEF plus 10% at both 4 and 8 pieces, so a nice 20% total. But the unique part is the 8-piece bonus. It gives Holden a flat 25% chance to counterattack with his S1 basic attack whenever he gets hit.
25% chance added to his pass.
Added right on top, yeah. Remember, his S1 passive gives 10% counter chance per 500 DEF, so you stack that with this flat 25% from Bramble. With enough DEF, his total counterattack chance can get really, really high. Very reliable.
So you build him tanky, let him get hit, and he just hits back constantly.
Pretty much, it's excellent for leaning into that counter identity, especially in content where he's likely to be targeted.
Cool. What else for 8-piece?
You can also just use the 8-piece versions of Unbreakable or Swiftrush if you're not running them as your main 12-piece set. That gets you the plus 25% DEF from Unbreakable or the plus 20% SPD from Swiftrush, respectively. Gives you flexibility in mixing and matching to hit your desired stack goals.
Bramble sounds really fun, though. Okay, so we've got 12-piece and 8-piece options. What about the final slots? Any recommended 6-piece sets from the Artisan pool?
Yeah, within the Artisan module selection, the main recommended 6-piece set is Collis Guard. This set provides DEF plus 25% and Effect RES plus 20%.
More DEF plus some resistance.
Exactly. It's a solid defensive choice that further boosts his core stat for scaling and adds a bit of protection against debuffs. It doesn't give any speed, but it complements a DF-focused build quite well.
Are there other common 6-piece sets people might think of?
Well, a very common 6-piece support set is Swift Smite, which gives speed and effect accuracy. But importantly, Swift Smite is not available in the Artisan module pool. So if you were using a different shell that did offer Swift Smite and you really felt you needed that extra speed and accuracy, it could be an option. But sticking with Artisan, Collis Guard is the standard 6-piece recommendation to fill out the build.
Okay, so a typical high-end Artisan build might look something like Artisan Shell plus maybe 12-piece Unbreakable for DF, plus 8-piece Bramble for counters, plus 6-piece Collis Guard for more DEF and res, or swapping Unbreakable for Swiftrush if speed is needed.
That's a very classic configuration, yeah.
Right.
Or you could do Artisan plus maybe 2 different 8-piece sets, plus a 4-piece, depending entirely on the specific substats you roll and whether you're trying to hit a specific DEF breakpoint or speed target. The key is looking at the modules available under Artisan and mixing them to get the best overall combination of set bonuses and substat rolls for the role you want Holden to play.
Right, speaking of roles, we touched on this, but let's nail down the skill priority. When you're spending those valuable skill upgrade materials, where should they go first? Does it depend on whether you're building him for damage or support?
Absolutely. It makes a huge difference. Your skill of priority should directly mirror what you want Holden to primarily do on your team.
So if I want him as my main damage dealer.
If you're building him as a primary DPS, aiming for that top-tier late-game damage we talked about, the priority is crystal clear. S1 level 5 first, then S3 level 5, then S2 level 5.
S1 first, definitely.
Definitely. You must max S1 first, because getting it to level 5 is what unlocks the full power of his execution mode. Passive at 10% counterattack and 5% final damage per 500 DEF. Without S1 at max, his DEF to damage scaling is severely handicapped. It's non-negotiable for a DPS build. After S1 is maxed, you level S3 for its strong AoE damage and utility, and then finish with S2.
Okay, S1 for DPS. What if I'm leaning more towards using him for his utility? The dispels, the debuffs, the S2 control?
If you're building a more support-focused Holden, where his utility is the main contribution, then the priority flips. S3 level 5 first, then S2 level 5, then S1 level 5.
S3 first for support. Why?
You prioritize S3 because getting it to level 5 reduces its cooldown to 3 turns, and crucially, it maximizes the base chance for the dispel debuffs before the crit interaction. Hitting 50% base chance per hit means that with crits, you hit that 100% application rate, making his utility super reliable. After S3, you level S2 to improve its damage and ensure the 100% chance on the turn meter CD lock effects. S1 comes last here because maximizing its damage isn't the main goal. The passive still works at lower levels, just not as powerfully.
Gotcha. S1 max for damage focus, S3 max for utility focus. That really clears up where to spend those precious resources based on your plan for him. Okay, so you've picked your shell, you've got your module sets figured out. Now it comes down to the stats and the actual gear pieces. What main stats and, more importantly, what substats should you be hunting for? This is often the most frustrating part of gearing.
Oh yeah, the stat hunt. And this is definitely where the nuance of a diff scaling character like Holden really shows. You need a careful balance. It's not as simple as just stacking one stat.
So, main stats first. On those big gear slots, head, body, feet equivalents, what are we looking for?
All right, for main stats, based on the guide's recommendations, on main stat slot 1, usually the headpiece slot, you're looking for either crit rate, crit DMG, or def percent. The equal sign there suggests they're all potentially viable, and your choice depends on what the rest of your gear looks like and what stat you need most to hit your targets.
Okay, flexible on the first slot. What about the second?
Main stat slot 2, body armor slot. Here, the recommendation narrows slightly to crit rate or def percent.
Crit rate or def percent, makes sense. And the third slot, usually boots.
Main stat slot 3, feet boot slot. Same as slot 2, crit rate or def percent.
Interesting. So no speed main stat recommended there. That's usually where speed boots go.
Exactly. It's a notable omission compared to many other characters. It strongly suggests that for Holden, getting speed is generally better achieved through substats, aiming for a specific target, rather than sacrificing a main stat slot that could be crit rate or def percent.
Hmm.
Unless maybe you were building a super niche pure speed utility Holden, but that's not the focus of the main build advice here.
Right, so across the main slots, you're constantly choosing between more DPS percent or more crit rate with crit DMG as an option on slot 1. Very different from just slapping ATK percent everywhere. Now, the real grind, substats. What's the priority order when you're looking at those random rolls on each piece?
Okay, substats. This is where you really fine-tune the build and chase those specific numbers. The priority order is really important here. Number one priority is SPD, but with a huge asterisk, until desired.
Until desired. What does that mean in practice?
It means you need to figure out, based on your team and the content you're running, how fast does Holden actually need to be. If you need him to outspeed a specific enemy in PvP to land S2, or if you need him to get his S3 debuffs up before a boss does something nasty in Termaton, then you need to prioritize SPD substats heavily until you hit that speed number.
But if you don't need him to be super fast?
If your team has TM boosters pulling him anyway, or if you're building a slower, counter-focused DPS build that doesn't rely on taking the first turn, then SPD becomes much less important after you hit a comfortable baseline. So it's top priority up to a point, and that point is determined by your specific needs. Number two priority, right after hitting your speed goal, is crit rate.
And this is crucial for everyone.
Absolutely essential. For both DPS and support builds, we already covered why for support it doubles the S3 effect chance on crit. For DPS, it's just fundamental for consistent damage output. A major endgame goal for pretty much any serious Holden build should be getting his total crit rate as close to 100% as possible. Use substats, main stats, his base prowess bonus, get it to 100%.
Okay, 100% crit rate is the target. What's next?
Number 3 is DEF percent, again with a condition, until next 500 breakpoint.
Ah, those S1 passive breakpoints again.
Exactly. DEF percent is his core scaling stat. It boosts damage, survival, and powers up that execution mode passive. 5% damage, 10% counter per 500 DF at a battle start. So you want a lot of it. But the strategy is to prioritize stacking DEF percent until you reach the next multiple of 500 total DFF on his stat sheet, like 2,500, 3,000, 3,500, etc.
Because crossing that threshold gives a significant power boost from S1.
Right. Once you hit a breakpoint, say 3,000 DES, the value of adding more DF percent drops slightly compared to getting more crit rate is not capped or crit damage unless you're really close to hitting the next breakpoint, 3,500 DF, and think you can get there efficiently with more DF percent and flat DF substats. So build DF percent strategically, aiming for those 500 milestones. Number 4 priority is crit DMG.
So crit damage comes after speed, crit rate, and DF percent breakpoints.
Generally, yes. Crit DMG multiplies the damage of your critical hits. It only becomes really effective once you're already critting very consistently, near 100% crit rate, and your base damage stat, DF, amplified by the S1 passive, is already high. Once you have, say, 3,000 or 3,500 plus def, and you're close to 100% crit rate, then stacking crit DMG starts giving you very significant increases to your overall damage output. It's the amplifier, not the foundation. And finally, number 5 is flat def.
Less impactful than def percent.
Yeah, def percent scales much better, but flat def still adds to his total def. Good rolls on flat def substats are still welcome, especially if they help push you over one of those 500 def breakpoints you were aiming for. Don't ignore it, but prioritize the others first.
Okay, wow. That is a really clear but complex substat hierarchy. Speed first, but only as much as needed. Then crit rate, aim for 100%. Then def percent, hitting 500 breakpoints. Then crit damage, and finally flat def. It's a real balancing act. What about the specific passive stat slots on the shell itself? Do those have priorities too?
They do. Shells have those 3 unique stat slots. For slot 1, you want def percent. That's optimal for boosting his main stat. Flat def is the fallback if you can't get def percent. For slot 2, it offers a choice: SPD, crit rate, or crit DMG. Your pick here should directly match your build focus. Need more speed? Take SPD. Need to top off crit rate? Take crit rate, got those covered, and want more damage? Take crit DMG. For slot 3, it depends on the build again. For DPS Holden, the best choice is Reason DMG percent, since that directly boosts his elemental damage. Generic DMG percent is second best. For support Holden, the options are listed as Gaze, an effect ACC set for longer fights, or Insight, effect ACC for shorter fights, or maybe even Reason DMG percent again.
Effect accuracy, is that really needed given the S3 crit interaction?
That's the key point. Based on how S3 works with crits providing a 100% application chance, effect accuracy is often considered less essential for Holden compared to other debuffers. If your crit rate is high, you might not need much or any extra effect accuracy, even for a support build. So Reason DMG percent might still be good here even for support, or you might take ACC if you're worried about facing very high effect RES enemies, or if your crit rate isn't quite 100% yet.
Okay, that detailed breakdown of stats main, substats, shell passives really connects the dots on how you execute the build based on his unique scaling and skills.
Yeah.
It's super clear that hitting 100% crit rate is basically non-negotiable for any serious build, and DF needs that strategic approach around the 500 thresholds for S1.
Exactly. It's not just about getting big numbers. It's about getting the right numbers in the right balance to make his whole kit work together optimally.
All right, we have dissected his kit, understood his potential, figured out skill priorities, and gone deep on gear shells, modules, stats.